The scream cut through Cedar Hill's silence just before sunset. By the time Marine Sergeant Luke Mason reached the road, a red truck was gone, an officer lay dying, and his daughter stood frozen beside their loyal German Shepherd Scout. What Luke uncovered next wasn't just an attack. It was the beginning of a war built on lies, greed, and brotherhood betrayed. Watch till the end to learn how a child's bravery and a dog's instinct unraveled a conspiracy years in the making. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story of faith, courage, and second chances. The evening light over Cedar Hill carried a softness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the sun itself wanted to keep the little town untouched a while longer. The pines along the ridge glowed with a thin amber sheen, their shadows long and gentle on the cracked asphalt. Grace Mason, 9 years old, small for her age but sharp-eyed, walked home with her backpack hanging from one shoulder and a German shepherd named Scout keeping pace at her side. His gait had the rhythm of disciplined, steady alert, each paw-fall placed as if he understood the value of silence. The road curved lazily downhill past the last cluster of mailboxes and the weathered sign that read, Cedar Hill, Pop 4, 216. It was that hour when the day begins. To hush dogs barked somewhere distant. A tractor engine coughed once and went still, and the world smelled faintly of pine needles and cooling tar. Dad said we might have pancakes for dinner. Grace said, her voice lilting with a secret joy. That's weird, right? Pancakes for dinner? Scout's ear flicked at the sound of her voice. He gave a low, approving chuff-tail, swaying once in a slow arc. You think it's weird, too? She teased. The dog's amber eyes shifted to her steady as a heartbeat. Yeah, I thought so. They reached the narrow wooden bridge that crossed a shallow creek, the boards slick from a shower earlier that day. Scout stopped nose raised, sniffing the air. The sound of running water filled the small silence. What is it? Grace whispered. The dog didn't answer, of course, but his stance set enough ears forward, shoulders squared a faint growl deep in his chest. Grace's eyes followed his gaze, expecting maybe a deer, maybe the neighbor's wandering goat again. Instead, a man's figure appeared at the far end of the bridge. He wore a police uniform and a calm half-smile that seemed carved by habit more than mood. Evening, he called. You two headed home. Officer Ryan Cole wasn't much older than her father, but he carried himself differently, lighter, less burdened. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight briefly. Yes, sir, Grace said. Our cabin's just up that way. She pointed. Dad's cooking dinner. He's not good at it, but he tries. Ryan chuckled softly. Trying counts. He crouched and held out a hand toward Scout, who stepped closer, sniffed once, and sat satisfied. Well-trained, Ryan said, glancing up at her. Marine dog used to be, Grace replied proudly. He worked with my dad overseas. Then he's earned that gray on his muzzle, Ryan said. He turned back toward his cruiser parked just ahead, a clipboard in one hand. The rustle of paper and the creak of leather filled the quiet. Scout, still sitting, watched him with that unblinking canine concentration, as if reading every movement. Grace crouched beside the dog, picking at a weed between the boards. We'll tell Dad we saw a cop, she said, and giggled. He'll probably tell me to salute or something. The breeze shifted. Scout's head snapped up. A sound rolled down the hill behind them, first a low vibration, then the harsh growl of an engine pushed too hard. Grace frowned, turning to look. The world seemed to narrow. The red pickup came out of the bend too fast, its headlights flickering, even though dusk hadn't yet settled. She thought at first it was just someone reckless. Then the truck straightened in the lane and didn't slow down. Scout barked once, the sound sharp and commanding, echoing across the bridge. Ryan looked up, his pen pausing mid-stroke. His body reacted faster than his mind, turning, stepping, reaching for the air that was suddenly filled with motion. The impact came like a hammer striking a bell. The truck hit him full on, throwing him sideways into the cruiser with a metallic crack before vanishing into the next curve. Paper fluttered everywhere like startled birds. Grace froze. The only sound left was the creak and the ticking of a cooling engine far away. Then she screamed a thin, tearing sound that didn't sound like hers. Scout lunged toward the fallen man, sniffing, circling, barking for help that wouldn't come soon enough. Ryan lay face up, one arm twisted, the badge on his chest, smeared dark. Officer Grace said, dropping beside him, her knees scraping on the wood. "Please wake up." His lips moved, maybe trying to say something, but only a faint wheeze came. Scout nosed at his face, whined once, and looked to Grace as if awaiting orders. Her small fingers fumbled with the phone in her pocket. She hit the first contact on her list. "Dad." She cried when he answered. "A man. He's hurt." The red truck hit him by the bridge. She could hear her father's voice steady and low on the other end. "Stay there, Gracie. Don't move. I'm coming." The line went dead. She looked back at Ryan. Blood had begun to pool beside his head, dark and shiny. The smell made her stomach twist. "You're gonna be okay," she whispered. "My dad's coming. He knows what to do." Scout planted himself at her side, his chest rising fast, eyes scanning the road ahead as though daring the truck to return. The last rays of sunlight caught the metal of Ryan's fallen pen near the curb. Grace noticed the pattern of the skid marks, two parallel streaks deepening right before the bridge, stopping just short of where he stood. "He stopped first," she whispered, voice trembling. "He stopped, then he hit him." In the distance, tires ground against gravel. Her father's old pickup roared around the bend. Luke Mason leapt out before the wheels stopped turning, his trauma kit slung across one shoulder. A Marine's reflexes fast, certain, already measuring the damage before emotion could interfere. He knelt beside the officer, checked the pulse, and pressed gauze to the wound with calm precision. "Grace, you okay?" he asked without looking up. She nodded, though tears streaked her face. "Scout stayed," she said. "He didn't run." Luke glanced at the dog, meeting eyes full of trust and questions. "Good boy," he murmured. The sirens were faint but growing closer now, a thread of help winding through the pines. Grace watched her father's hands move, decisive, practiced, while Scout stood guard over all of them. The air smelled of pine sap and iron. She realized the evening wasn't quiet anymore. It was listening. The sirens swelled, blue lights flickering against the tree trunks. Luke looked toward the road where the red truck had vanished, jaw tightening. Something colder than shock settled behind his eyes. Grace followed his gaze, sensing the same wrongness, the way peace had cracked open, revealing something dark beneath. Scout gave a final low growl toward the hills, as if he too had seen the shape of the danger they couldn't yet name. The siren was still distant when Luke Mason pressed his hands against the wound on Officer Ryan Cole's head, counting in his mind to keep the rhythm of breathing steady. His fingers moved with an automatic precision that came not from calm, but from repetition field drills, combat medevacs, all the ghosts of training that never left a Marine, even when he tried to. The blood was warm through the gauze. "Stay with me, officer," he said quietly. Ryan's eyelids flickered like old film trying to find its frame. Grace stood nearby, small and trembling, her hands gripping Scout's collar, though the dog didn't need restraint. Scout stayed low, muzzle near Ryan's cheek, his breath quick and steady, as if urging the man to keep breathing. Luke felt the pulse, faint but present. That was enough. The ambulance would make the rest possible. He kept pressure on the wound and used his other hand to open Ryan's airway, tilting his chin gently. "Grace, talk to him," Luke said without looking up. "Just talk. Keep him awake." She nodded, voice quivering but sure, telling Ryan about the pancakes, about Scout's old medal, about anything that kept sound in the air. When the paramedics arrived, Luke briefed them in clipped phrases. Head trauma, pulse weak but stable, possible internal bleeding. They slid the stretcher down and he stepped back only when the straps clicked. Scout followed each motion, the low growl in his throat softening to a worried hum. The paramedics thanked Luke, loading Ryan into the ambulance. One of them recognized him. Sergeant Mason Wright, Marine Corps. Luke only nodded. The man gave a short nod back, professional respect exchanged without words. As the siren pulled away, Luke's shoulders dropped, but the calm didn't last. His eyes drifted to the road where the red pickup had vanished. The faint marks on the asphalt told their own story, two deep ruts merging at an angle too deliberate to be loss of control. He walked toward them slowly, flashlight in hand, now its beam slicing through dusk. Grace watched him from the porch where a neighbor had led her to sit blanket around her shoulders. Scout stood halfway between father and daughter, uneasy, torn between watching both. Luke crouched by the edge of the asphalt. He ran a finger through the tire impressions, feeling the ridged pattern like fingerprints. He had seen that pattern before, somewhere overseas, in convoys that ran military supplies across dust roads. He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, pressed it lightly against the groove, then lifted it to his nose. A faint chemical tang lingered there, not ordinary motor oil, but the sterile metallic scent of a specialized rubber compound used in military transport. Scout padded closer, nose low, tail rigid. He sniffed the same patch, then looked up, ears twitching in a short, sharp pattern Luke recognized. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. "You smell it too, don't you, buddy?" Luke murmured. He followed the dog's lead as Scout moved along the shoulder past where gravel met the wooden rail of the bridge. The animal stopped, suddenly pawing at a patch of disturbed dirt where stones had been pushed aside in a tight semicircle. Luke crouched again, the beam of the flashlight tracing the pattern. The ground showed a clear imprint, a stop, then a burst forward. Whoever drove that truck had paused here just long enough to aim. He stood scanning the tree line. The forest was quiet now, holding its breath. Luke's pulse slowed, but his mind began its old work, the silent calculation of threat and intent. He turned back to the spot, took a photo with his phone, then another close-up of the chemical residue glinting faintly under the light. It wasn't much, but it was something. He'd learned long ago that truth often began as dust and fragments. Scout gave a low bark, drawing Luke's attention to a sliver of red paint scraped onto a wooden guardrail. He reached out, touched it carefully. The color was dulled by dust, but unmistakable. "Red truck," he whispered. His thumb rubbed the flake against his palm, leaving a faint smear. He pocketed it the way he used to pocket coordinates and fragments of evidence on deployment, each small piece a map toward an answer. Grace called softly from the porch. "Dad." He looked up, his voice gentler now. "It's okay, sweetheart. Go inside. I'll be right there." She hesitated, then obeyed. Scout lingering a moment before trotting back to her. Luke stayed alone with the road. He watched the last ambulance light fade behind the ridge and felt the silence settle like a heavy coat. He could almost hear his old commanding officer's voice observe record, never assume coincidence. The phrase had kept him alive once. It returned now unwelcome but necessary. He turned toward the creek where the water moved dark under the bridge, reflecting the fractured glow of his flashlight. For the first time, he noticed faint tire residue near the bank mud still moist from the rain earlier that week. A tire had slipped, regained traction, and driven off uphill, not away from town, but toward the wooded ridge. That was wrong. If someone fled, they'd go for the highway, not the ridge. Unless they knew a path the rest didn't. Luke exhaled cold mist, leaving his lips. The idea formed sharp and certain whoever hit Ryan had planned it, had known this road, and had known how to disappear into Cedar Hill's back routes. He shut off the light, letting his eyes adjust to the dim. Somewhere down the slope an owl called once. The sound should have comforted him. It didn't. He looked toward the house, saw Grace framed in the window, Scout's head visible beside her knee. The dog's silhouette was alert even now, watching him. Luke gave a small nod, part signal, part promise. Then he stepped back onto the bridge, his boots leaving faint imprints in the damp boards beside the blood that the rain would soon begin to wash away. When he reached the porch, Grace slipped her hand into his. "He'll live, right?" she asked. Luke answered quietly. "He's strong. He'll fight." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Like you." He smiled, weary but true. "Like us." Scout settled beside them, sighing into the cool night. Luke's gaze drifted again to the dark road beyond the mailbox. It no longer looked familiar, no longer safe. The quiet world of Cedar Hill had changed shape, and he knew what that meant. His war wasn't over. It had only come home. The night had grown heavy over Cedar Hill, the kind that carried a stillness too deep to trust. Inside the Mason cabin, the only sound was the ticking clock and the slow breath of a house settling against the cold. Luke sat at the kitchen table, a half-drained mug of coffee beside the sheriff's report on the red truck. His eyes were sharp, restless, scanning the same lines again and again without really reading them. Upstairs, Grace slept fitfully, her hand tangled in Scout's fur. The old German shepherd lay across her legs, head lifted slightly, eyes never fully closed. When the wind shifted outside, Scout's ears twitched. His muscles tightened and a low, rumbling growl broke the quiet. Luke looked up the sound, waking something in him, a reflex built from nights in far darker places. He rose, crossed to the window, and peered into the darkness. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Scout's gaze stayed locked on the tree line, his fur bristling along his back. Luke grabbed the flashlight from the shelf, pulled open the door, and stepped into the cold. The air outside bit at his skin, sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet soil. The porch light pushed a pale circle into the fog, but beyond it the world turned to shadow. Scout moved beside him, silent and precise, nose low to the ground. Somewhere in the woods, a twig snapped a quick, deliberate sound. Luke swung the beam toward it, catching only mist and branches shifting in the wind. "Easy," he said softly, though his own pulse had started to rise. Scout stayed rigid for a moment longer before letting out a short huff, then turned back toward the door. Luke waited a beat, scanning the dark one last time, then followed him inside. Miles away, the hospital lights flickered once and steadied. The security cameras blinked, resetting for less than a second, just long enough. In room 12, Officer Ryan Cole slept under the glow of a single overhead lamp for drip ticking quietly beside him. The door opened without sound. A man stepped in, his movements calm, too controlled to belong to panic or accident. Dressed in black, hood pulled low, he crossed the room in 3 measured steps. He checked the monitors, adjusted the flow of medication, and leaned closer to the unconscious officer. The camera outside caught only a sliver of his face, reflected in the window just enough to see the ring glinting on his finger, a gold band etched with the eagle globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. The man whispered something inaudible, a tone low and steady before turning to leave. As he stepped back, a sound from the hall, the squeak of a cartwheel, made him pause. He shifted toward the shadows, his coat brushing against the bedrail. Something small slipped from his pocket and landed on the tile floor without a sound. When the noise faded, he slipped through the door and vanished into the corridor. By dawn, Luke's phone rang. Sheriff Linda Graves's voice came through low and strained. "Luke, I need you to come to the hospital. It's about Cole." The drive was silent except for the hum of the truck and the wind against the windows. Scout sat in the passenger seat, eyes forward, the glove Luke had taken from the scene still on the dashboard. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and fatigue. Graves met him at the entrance, her face pale beneath the fluorescence. "Cole's alive," she said, "but someone tampered with his IV last night. We pulled the footage." She led him into the security room where a monitor displayed a grainy video. A hooded figure crossed the frame, posture straight, deliberate. Graves hit pause. "We couldn't get a clear face, but look at his hand." Luke leaned closer. The light caught the glint of gold on the man's ring finger. The Marine Corps insignia was worn but unmistakable. "Can you zoom in?" he asked. Graves did. The frame tightened and Luke's stomach turned cold. "That ring," he said quietly. "It's my brother's." Graves frowned. "Your brother." "The one who Captain Ethan Mason Luke finished for her. Killed in action. Afghanistan, 5 years ago." He stepped closer to the screen, eyes tracing the shape of the hand. "That's his ring. There's a dent on the right edge. He hit it on a Humvee door the night before deployment." Graves crossed her arms. "You're sure?" "Completely," Luke said. "I gave it to him myself." Graves handed him an evidence bag. Inside lay a single black glove torn near the wrist. "Found beside the IV stand," she said. "Old model. Military issue. Whoever broke in wasn't here to rob anyone." Luke studied the glove, turning it over in his hand. The fabric was stiff and carried a faint scent, diesel sand and smoke. Scout sniffed it once, then froze his body rigid tail low. He let out a soft, almost mournful whine. Luke's chest tightened. "You smell it too, don't you?" he murmured. "You remember." Graves tilted her head. "That dog served with your brother. They trained together before Ethan shipped out," Luke replied quietly. "Scout belonged to his unit before they retired him." She nodded slowly. "Maybe he's reacting to something familiar." Maybe, Luke said, though the word didn't convince either of them. He drove home through thin morning fog, the glove resting on the seat beside him. Scout's head stayed low, ears flicking with every shift of the wind. Back at the cabin, Grace met them at the door, still half asleep. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. Luke forced a small smile. "Yeah, honey. Go eat your breakfast." When she turned away, he sat by the fireplace, the glove between his hands. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. "It doesn't make sense," he said softly. "If Ethan's alive, why come back like this?" Scout settled at his feet, head resting on Luke's boot, eyes on the glove. Outside, a gust of wind pushed against the window, bending the trees like bowing silhouettes. Luke looked toward the glass. The reflection staring back at him was steady, but his eyes carried that old look, half soldier, half brother, caught between disbelief and duty. "If it's really you," he whispered, "tell me what you're doing here." The only answer was the wind whispering through the woods that once felt like home but now held something else, something waiting. The morning light over Cedar Hill carried no warmth. Luke Mason parked outside the hospital, watching the fog drift low over the asphalt. The night's questions still clung to him, the ring, the glove, the shadow that smelled like his brother. Scout sat rigid in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the hospital entrance, as if sensing what waited inside. When Luke stepped through the sliding doors, Sheriff Linda Graves was already there, coffee untouched in her hand, the weariness in her eyes hidden beneath practiced calm. "Ryan's conscious," she said quietly. "Barely. He's asking for you." Luke followed her down the corridor where the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. In room 12, the steady rhythm of a heart monitor filled the silence. Officer Ryan Cole lay pale beneath a thin blanket, his breathing shallow. Luke approached the bed slowly. "It's Mason," he said softly. "You're safe now, Ryan." Ryan's eyelids flickered, his lips trembling as if to form words that cost him too much. Luke leaned closer, close enough to feel the uneven warmth of his breath. "Low Hang, Cedar Hill." Ryan whispered the syllables, breaking between shallow gasps. The monitor spiked alarms blaring as nurses rushed in. Luke stepped back while they worked, but Scout, who had been lying quietly near the door, rose abruptly and approached the bed. The dog's ears flattened, body tense, reacting not to sound but to something deeper, the rapid beat of fear filling the room. His low growl was soft, uncertain, almost human. Luke laid a hand on his neck. "It's all right, boy." But both knew it wasn't. Later that morning, Luke stood in Graves's office, the blinds half drawn against the gray light. Files covered her desk maps pinned with red markers showing routes across the hills. She pushed a folder toward him. "You heard what he said, Cedar Hill shipment." Luke nodded. "That's what it sounded like." "That phrase isn't random," she said. Ryan was investigating smuggling disguised as medical transport. A quiet case off the books. He didn't trust anyone in his department. She flipped open the folder showing grainy photographs of cargo crates stamped with faded hospital logos. "These were seized last week, listed as disinfectant supplies, but the manifest doesn't match the chemical analysis." Luke studied the photos. "Who ran these transports?" "Ridgeway Medical Logistics," she said, watching his reaction. His expression tightened. "They supplied my rescue unit 2 years ago. We used their trucks for field operations." Graves nodded. Ryan suspected they were covering for something bigger. Maybe chemicals, maybe weapons components. "We don't know. But the timing of his hit and these seizures isn't coincidence." Scout resting at Luke's feet lifted his head at the word shipment. His nose twitched a faint growl rumbling in his throat. Graves noticed. "Your dog's reacting." Luke gave a small nod. "He's trained for detection. If those crates carried anything military, he'll pick it up." Graves stood. "We have one in evidence storage. Let's test him." The storage bay was cold and smelled of rust. A single overhead light flickered above a stack of wooden crates marked with the Ridgeway logo. Graves pried one open with a crowbar, revealing plastic containers sealed tight and labeled surface sterilizer, medical use only. She set one on a metal table. "We took samples," she said. "The lab couldn't identify the compound. Too dense for standard sterilizers." Luke removed the cap just enough for a whiff of air to escape. The scent hit him instantly sharp chemical with an undertone of metallic sweetness. It dragged him back across years and miles to desert air and burned soil. "This isn't medical," he said quietly. "It's a stabilizer compound. We used it overseas to neutralize explosive residue. Restricted use only." Graves frowned. "You're sure?" 100%, Luke said. "You can't buy this without military clearance." Scout stepped forward before Luke could stop him. He sniffed the open crate once, then stiffened tail-dropping and let out a deep guttural growl that built until it echoed against the concrete. He circled the crate nose pressed close and barked once sharp and defiant. Luke pulled him back, but the dog's body stayed tense. His eyes locked on the chemical containers as if facing an old enemy. "He recognizes the smell," Luke said. "It's the same compound used on bases during munitions cleanup." Graves stared at the crate. So someone's smuggling military material under the guise of hospital supplies. Luke closed the lid firmly. "And using the same supply line my unit once used." The sheriff's radio crackled to life. "Unit 4 to command." A deputy's voice called. "We've got 2 unmarked vans leaving the Cedar Ridge depot. No tags, tinted windows heading north." Graves grabbed the mic. "Hold position. Don't engage." She turned to Luke. "They're clearing the site. Ryan must have spooked them. Or someone warned them," Luke said. Graves hesitated. "You think there's a leak?" "There's always a leak," he said. "Someone with access to transport records routes manifests. Maybe someone who worked logistics for Ridgeway." He didn't say what else he was thinking. Maybe someone who once served beside him. They walked out into the damp air behind the building. The rain had begun again, thin but steady, the kind that blurred the edges of the hills. Scout stayed close, his fur damp, his breath visible in the cold. Luke crouched beside him, resting a hand on his back. "You've smelled this before, haven't you?" he said softly. The dog blinked once, slow, his head tilting as if in answer. Luke straightened, turning toward the distant ridge. "Whoever's behind this," he said, "isn't hiding in some city warehouse. They're here using the land, the routes, the people we trusted." Graves folded her arms. "Luke, this is bigger than a local case. It crosses state lines, maybe federal." He met her gaze, calm but resolved, then let it cross. "I'm not backing off now." Scout gave a short, sharp bark, and Luke glanced down at him with a faint, grim smile. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're going hunting." The next morning broke dim and colorless over Cedar Hill. Fog hung low across the valley, heavy and unmoving, pressing against the Mason cabin like a slow tide. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. Grace woke early, expecting to hear the familiar sound of Scout's claws tapping across the kitchen floor, but the house was silent. She called softly, "Scout," and waited. Nothing. Pulling on her sweater, she stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick with dew, her breath misting in the cold air. The leash that usually hung neatly on the railing now dangled by a single thread. The leather had been sliced clean through its edges, sharp, deliberate. It swayed gently in the wind. Grace froze her eyes, following the path down toward the gate. The latch was open. The gate itself swung slowly back and forth, creaking in the gray light. Her chest tightened. "Scout!" she shouted, her voice echoing across the yard. The only answer was the low rustle of trees. She ran down the steps, her slippers sinking into the damp earth. The ground told its own story. Fresh prints leading away from the house, not just paws, but boots deep and wide heading into the woods. She dropped to her knees, touching the soil with trembling fingers. The mud was still wet. Whoever had taken him hadn't been gone long. By the time Luke returned from the sheriff's office an hour later, Grace was waiting in the driveway, her face streaked with tears, clutching the broken leash. "Dad Scout's gone," she said, her voice shaking. Luke took the leash gently, studying the cut. His stomach turned. "When did you see him last?" "Last night. He slept by my bed." She pointed toward the gate. "It was open when I woke up." Luke crouched, tracing the marks near the fence with his fingertips. "Boots," he murmured. "Military pattern size 11, maybe 12. He stood jaw tight. "Go inside, Grace. Lock every door. Don't open for anyone but me or Sheriff Graves." "What about Scout?" she whispered. "He'll come home," Luke said softly, though his eyes betrayed doubt. An hour later, Sheriff Graves arrived. Her cruiser's tires hissed over the wet gravel as she stepped out, scanning the yard. Luke met her on the porch, holding the leash. "Clean cut," she said after a glance. "Professional blade." Luke nodded. "This wasn't random. They wanted me to know they could get close." Graves walked to the open gate, kneeling beside the muddy footprints. Whoever this was, she said they weren't hiding. These tracks, broad stance, steady gait, trained, confident. Luke's voice hardened. "You think it's connected to Ridgeway? I think whoever's behind that shipment knows you're digging too deep," she said. "And they just took your dog to remind you." The hours that followed stretched like wire. Grace sat by the living room window, clutching Scout's old collar tag in both hands. The radio played faintly, a preacher's voice talking about faith and trials. Luke couldn't listen. He moved from room to room, checking locks, double-securing the shed, loading the rifle he hadn't touched since his last deployment. By dusk, the rain returned soft at first, then steady, turning the yard to mud. The porch light cast a weak halo through the mist. Grace refused to sleep. She sat curled on the couch, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the sound of paws, the shake of water off a familiar coat. Luke stood behind her, trying not to let her see how tightly he held his jaw. It was after midnight when he noticed something strange. As he turned off the last lamp, the porch light flickered once, catching a small reflection on the door, something metallic just beneath the peephole. He frowned and stepped closer. A square object was stuck there with a strip of tape. He peeled it off and felt his breath stop. It was Scout's tracking chip, the military-issued locator embedded in his harness. The casing was intact, cleanly removed, not broken. Someone had taken it off carefully, precisely, and brought it here. Luke turned it over in his hand. On the back, scrawled in faint grease pencil, were 5 words. "We know where you are." The handwriting was rough but deliberate, every stroke meant to be seen. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he set the chip down on the table beside the lamp. The rain outside had stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost aware. Headlights flashed once through the window, a vehicle at the far end of the road engine idling, then reversing slowly back into the fog. Luke crossed to the light switch, turning everything off. The room fell into shadow. He stood by the window, watching, but the headlights were gone now, swallowed by the mist. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Grace's small voice drifted down. "Dad." He forced calm into his tone. "It's all right. Go back to bed." She came halfway down the stairs anyway, her eyes finding the chip on the table. "Is that Scout's?" she asked. "Yeah," he said softly. "They left it." She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. When she finally went back upstairs, Luke sat down at the table, the chip between his fingers. He turned it over again, tracing the words with his thumb. The writing wasn't just a warning. It was a provocation. They wanted him to feel the edge, to know that no lock, no light, no distance could keep them out. He stared at the door, the faint shape of the fog pressing against the glass. Somewhere out there, Scout was either alive or bait, and either way the message was clear. They'd crossed his threshold. He reached for the small radio in the drawer, the old military frequency band still programmed from his service years. He pressed transmit once, twice, hearing only static in response. "If you can hear me, boy," he whispered. "Hold on." He placed the chip into his pocket, grabbed his jacket, and stepped onto the porch. The fog swallowed him instantly. Beyond the gate, the woods waited silent, vast, and listening. The first call came at 12:47 a.m. Luke Mason was still awake, sitting by the window, the rain tapping softly against the glass. The dispatcher's voice over the radio was urgent, shaking. "Station storage is burning, total loss request, immediate assistance." Luke grabbed his jacket and was out the door in seconds, boots splashing through puddles as his truck tore down the narrow mountain road. From a mile away he could already see it, a column of smoke rising above the trees, pulsing orange and black against the low clouds. When he reached the lot behind the police station, the evidence warehouse was an inferno. The night glowed with a terrible light, flames chewing through the wooden structure that had stood there for decades. Firefighters worked frantically, their shouts drowned by the roar of burning fuel. The air stank of melted metal and chemicals. Sheriff Linda Graves stood near the barrier tape coat, soaked through her face, pale in the flickering glow. "We've lost everything," she said as Luke approached, breathless. Every file, every recording, every sample tied to the hit on Ryan. He stared at the collapsing roof sparks shooting into the rain. Any sign of what started it? Graves shook her head. Too hot, too fast. Fire Marshal's preliminary says it was lit with a military-grade accelerant. Luke turned sharply. "Jet fuel close," she said. "Something like JP-8, not civilian accessible." He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. Someone had access to base supplies. Graves nodded grimly, and they knew what to hit first. The evidence servers went up before the alarm even tripped. By sunrise, the fire was out. Steam hissed off the blackened wreckage as Luke and Graves walked through what was left. The air was thick with the sting of burned paper and oil. Charred fragments of files clung to the chain-link fence like dark leaves. This wasn't about destruction, Luke said. It was about silence. Graves kicked at a melted beam. "And the timing's too perfect. The files were due for transfer to state investigators tomorrow." She looked up, eyes hard. They erased the trail. Back inside the sheriff's office, the air was heavy with smoke and fatigue. Graves poured coffee that neither of them drank. She laid a single sheet on the desk between them, an internal access report. Security logs show the building's system was shut down 20 minutes before the fire started, she said. Remote override internal clearance. Luke frowned. From whose terminal? She hesitated. Ryan Cole's. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Luke shook his head. That's impossible. He's been in a hospital bed since the crash. Graves rubbed her temples. His credentials were used. Either someone cloned his ID, or he had help before he went down. Luke stared at the list of timestamps and signal traces. The path of the override had been masked through 3 different relay points too clean for an amateur. This wasn't done by someone inside the building, he said quietly. This was someone who understands encryption. Military precision. Graves looked at him carefully. You're thinking it might be one of your own. He didn't answer immediately. The thought stung more than he wanted to admit. I'm thinking someone who served knows how to cover their tracks, and if they used Ryan's code, they wanted it to point straight at us. Graves crossed her arms. Luke, we can't use the department network anymore. Everything's compromised. I'll pull what's left of the staff off digital comms and go manual. Paper radios face-to-face only. Luke nodded. Good. Keep it small. Whoever this is, they're watching every move we make. He stepped toward the window, watching as smoke from the ruin drifted across the gray morning sky. They torched every piece of truth we had, he said, and they'll keep burning until there's nothing left to trace. Graves's voice softened. We'll rebuild the case. We'll find new leads. Luke turned to her, his expression carved from exhaustion. We don't have time to rebuild. They've already moved on to cleanup. Scouts taken. The fire was a message. Graves studied him for a long moment. You really think the two are connected? Yes, he said simply. Same level of planning, same kind of discipline. This isn't about hiding evidence anymore, it's about control. She hesitated. Then we're fighting a war on 2 fronts. He looked back toward the smoldering wreckage outside. No, he said softly. Just one. The front line's right here. Before leaving, Graves handed him a small envelope sealed in plastic. Found this in the ash near the server rack, she said. Inside was a half-melted piece of dog tag metal. The engraving was almost gone, but a few letters remained. USMCE. Mason. Luke's pulse quickened. His brother's tag. You sure it came from there? He asked. Graves nodded. No one else's name starts with that combination. He turned the metal over in his palm, the edges still black with soot. Whoever set the fire wanted him to find this. Another reminder that the ghosts he thought buried overseas had followed him home. As the wind picked up, scattering the last embers across the lot, Luke stood alone for a moment, the tag cold in his hand. The world around him was silent except for the crackle of dying fire. Inside the ashes of truth, the war he'd tried to leave behind had just reignited, only this time it wasn't fought with uniforms or flags. It was fought in the shadows of his own town by people who wore the same badge and spoke the same oaths. The week after the fire felt longer than a year. Cedar Hill's sky stayed overcast, the clouds hanging low and heavy as if the whole mountain held its breath. Luke Mason hadn't slept more than a few hours each night, and even then dreams of smoke and sirens chased him awake. Sheriff Graves called him early on a Thursday morning. We got one, she said simply. Within the hour, Luke stood in the narrow hallway outside the interrogation room at the county station. Through the small window, a man sat slumped at the table, mid-30s, unshaven. His hands cuffed his jacket, torn and streaked with mud. Name's Daniel Ross Graves, said beside him. Caught him on the old Ridge Road, driving a truck that matches the red paint we pulled from Ryan's crash. Luke studied the man quietly. There was something off about his calm, the way he rolled his shoulders as if he weren't caught but merely delayed. What's he said so far? Luke asked. Not much. Graves replied, just that he did what he was told. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and gasoline. Luke sat across from him, folding his hands on the table. "You want to tell me why you were driving a red truck through a crime scene?" Ross smirked faintly. "Didn't know I had to explain my roots." Luke's voice stayed calm, steady. "You were hired, weren't you?" For a second, something flickered in Ross's eyes, a crack in his indifference. "You don't understand," he muttered. "They said it wasn't supposed to go that far, just a warning. Then they said finish the job." Luke's heart slowed. Finish what job? Ross swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. The cop that lived, and the Marine who wouldn't stop asking questions. He didn't look up again. Graves leaned in from behind the glass. "We can link him to the warehouse fire. His boots match the prints near the east gate." Luke nodded but stayed focused on the man. Something about the scent in the air tugged at him, a familiar sharpness, metallic and bitter. "That smell on your jacket," Luke said quietly. "You know what it is?" Ross frowned. "Gasoline." "Not quite," Luke replied. "That's jet fuel, military blend, the same one that burned down our evidence room." The man's expression twitched, surprise flickering just long enough to confirm everything. "Where'd you get it?" Luke pressed. "I don't know." "Names?" Ross stammered. "They called from a blocked number. Said I'd get paid if I made sure the message was clear." Graves entered, then signaling the deputies. "Get him booked." No bail. That evening, the rain broke for the first time in days. The town breathed again, if only for a moment. Luke drove home under a thin slice of sunset, the light soft and forgiving. Grace was waiting on the porch, her face bright for the first time in weeks. "Dad!" She cried. "They found him." Luke froze. "Who, Scout?" she said, holding up the leash. "A ranger found him near the South Creek." Luke followed her to the truck parked by the gate. A uniformed ranger opened the back door, and there he was. Thinner ribs showing fur matted with dirt, but alive. The moment Scout saw Luke, his tail lifted weakly, eyes bright with recognition. Luke knelt, and Scout pressed his head against his chest, breathing in slow, ragged bursts. Grace wiped at her eyes, laughing through tears. "He came back, Dad. He's home." Later at the vet's office, the technician confirmed the chip had been removed cleanly. "Professional job," she said. "But he's lucky. No infections. He's strong." Luke sat beside Scout, one hand resting on his back. "You did good, boy," he whispered. When they returned home, the house felt different, fuller, warmer. Scout ate slowly, then lay by the fire, eyes half closed. For the first time in weeks, Grace fell asleep without fear. The next morning, Graves brought evidence bags from the fire site for Luke to review. "Thought you might see something we missed." He nodded, unsealing one bag. Inside was a burned scrap of uniform fabric soaked in faint residue. He laid it near Scout, who sniffed once, then froze. A low growl built deep in his chest, the same sound Luke had heard that night in the woods. The dog's fur, bristled eyes fixed on the bag as if staring down an old enemy. "Same smell?" Graves asked quietly. Luke nodded. "Same fuel. Whoever torched the place handled it themselves." For a few days, peace returned in small pieces. Luke repaired the back gate. Grace went back to school. Scout regained strength, following Luke everywhere again, his steps slower but sure. It felt almost normal until Friday evening. The mail came late, a single envelope with no return address, no stamp. Grace handed it to him without thought. Luke slid it open, expecting a bill, maybe a form from the vet. But inside were photographs. Just one set printed on matte paper. The first image froze his blood. Scout locked inside a metal cage. Eyes clear, the date stamp in the corner, 11:42 p.m., the previous night. Luke stared at it for a long time before realizing his hands were shaking. He flipped through the rest. There were more shots. The cabin porch, the back gate, even a blurred frame of Grace's window taken from the tree line. The last photo was of the leash hook empty again. He could feel the walls closing and the illusion of safety vanishing like smoke. Whoever they were, they hadn't stopped. They were still there, watching close enough to touch. 3 weeks after the fire, a sliver of dawn crept through the hospital blinds, painting the sterile room in pale gold. The monitor beside Ryan Cole's bed beeped softly steady for the first time in weeks. Sheriff Linda Graves stood near the foot of the bed, arms crossed, exhaustion shadowing her eyes. Luke Mason watched in silence as Ryan stirred his breathing hitching before settling into an uneven rhythm. When he finally opened his eyes, confusion flickered there first, then recognition. "Luke," he rasped, voice raw. Luke leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "You're safe, Ryan. You've been out for a while." Ryan blinked, trying to gather the fragments of thoughts scattered across his memory. "The truck," he murmured. "Red pickup. The man driving, he wasn't local. He was hired." Graves exchanged a glance with Luke. "Do you know who?" Ryan swallowed, then nodded faintly. "Rick Dalton," he whispered. "He ran the Denver distribution line. Logistics chief. Disappeared after an internal probe about stolen military shipments." His gaze drifted toward Luke. He had contacts everywhere. The Ridgeway routes, the warehouse fire, Dalton's behind all of it. Graves's pen stilled above her notebook. "You're sure?" Ryan coughed, a flicker of bitterness crossing his face. "He was my mentor once. He taught me how to move things quietly." Later that morning, back at the sheriff's office, Graves spread the new file across the desk. Dalton's record was long commendations transfers, and then the sudden suspension 5 years ago after a classified inquiry into missing medical convoys. Luke scanned the page, his hand tightening on the edge of the desk. "He vanished the same year Ethan's unit went dark," he said quietly. Graves frowned. "Ethan Mason?" Luke nodded. "My brother." Her expression softened, but only slightly. "The one declared KIA. That's what the report said," Luke replied. "Explosion near Kandahar. No remains recovered." Graves slid another folder across the desk, her tone low. "Luke, there's something you need to see." Inside were photocopies of requisition forms and shipping manifests recovered from Ridgeway's burned files. Every signature was a match. Each document authorizing fake shipments, she said, was signed by a Captain Ethan Mason. The words hung heavy between them. Luke stared at the page, the handwriting painfully familiar, his brother's neat, deliberate cursive. For a long moment, the room seemed smaller, the walls pressing closer. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "He's dead. Or someone's using his name," Graves said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We're running a full verification, but the ink is fresh. These signatures were made within the last 2 years." Luke's jaw tightened. "You think my brother's alive?" Graves hesitated. "I think someone with his clearance is signing off on military-grade shipments under his identity. Whether it's him or not, we need to find out." Scout lay near the door, head resting on his paws, watching every movement in the room. When Graves opened a storage cabinet to pull an evidence bag, a folded military jacket fell from the shelf. Weathered fabric, darkened with age, the patch still intact. Mason-y Luke froze. "Where did you get that?" "Recovered from the warehouse perimeter," Graves said. "Found after the fire." She placed it on the table. The scent of smoke and fuel clung to it even now. Scout lifted his head instantly, nostrils flaring. He stood tail stiff and approached the jacket cautiously. At first he sniffed once, curious, then suddenly his body tensed. A deep growl rolled through his chest, low and steady, the kind he used when danger was near. Luke tried to calm him. "Easy, boy." But Scout didn't relax. He circled the table fur rising along his spine, his eyes locked on the fabric as though confronting something unseen. Graves stepped back. That reaction, he knows that scent. Luke's voice was barely above a whisper. He does. He reached out, touching the name patch with his fingertips, memories flashing like lightning. Ethan's laughter, the smell of oil and dust, the promise made before deployment. I'll come back. The air in the room thickened with a silence that neither of them broke. Graves finally spoke. If this jacket's authentic, and if Scout's reaction means what I think it does, we may be dealing with someone who didn't die in Afghanistan. Luke's gaze hardened his mind, turning over the impossible. If my brother's alive, he said slowly, then he's not the man I remember. That night, rain returned to the mountains, soft and relentless. Luke drove back to the cabin in silence, the wipers tracing slow arcs across the windshield. Scout sat beside him restless, his nose twitching toward the window as if sensing ghosts in the rain. Grace was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her small figure framed by the warm glow from inside. "Dad, she called you okay?" He forced a faint smile. "Yeah," he said. "Just a long day." But as he looked past her into the dim light of the house, his thoughts were far away in desert heat, in firelight, in the echo of his brother's voice calling from a time that refused to stay buried. The storm rolled in without warning, a black wall swallowing the horizon. Rain came down hard, drumming against the roof of the Mason cabin, shaking the windows with every gust. Luke stood by the table map, spread before him the photo of the metal warehouse lying at the center. The one sent in the envelope, the same warehouse where Scout had once been caged. The storm outside seemed to echo the one inside his chest. Scout paced restlessly near the door, head lowered, ears pinned back. Every few seconds he let out a low whine and turned toward the window, nose twitching. Luke watched him, unease settling like lead in his stomach. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. The dog barked once sharp and insistent, then ran to the back door, pawing at the handle. Luke opened it, and Scout bolted into the rain nose to the ground tail, stiff with purpose. Luke grabbed his flashlight, raincoat, and pistol and followed him into the storm. The beam of light cut through sheets of rain, glinting off wet pine needles and mud. Scout led him down the ridge trail, the same direction as the tracks from the night of the abduction. The smell of rain mixed with gasoline and something older metallic. The dog didn't hesitate once. He was following his own scent, retracing the path where he had been dragged weeks ago. The thunder cracked like artillery overhead, and the trail grew steeper, darker. Then, through the rain, Luke saw the outline of a corrugated metal warehouse rising from the trees. Its walls streaked with rust, the same structure from the photo. The front gate hung open. The smell of fuel was heavy in the air. Inside, the light of Luke's flashlight swept over stacks of crates, broken machinery, and a single table in the center. A figure stepped out from behind it, tall and broad, his movements deliberate, his voice familiar, even through the thunder. "You shouldn't have come here, Luke." Luke froze, his breath catching in his throat. Ethan. The man who stepped into the light was not the brother he remembered. His face was half hidden beneath scars, one eye milky with damage, his uniform jacket worn but clean. The years had turned him into something harder, quieter. "You're alive," Luke said, voice barely steady. Why Ethan's eyes met his, calm, haunted. To expose them, he said, "The command, the corruption. I faked my death because that was the only way to get inside their system. Everything, the shipments, the false papers, the fire, it's all connected to something bigger. I had to let it run to see who was pulling the strings." Luke stepped closer, rain dripping from his coat. "And the smuggling. The soldiers you used." Ethan's voice hardened. "Collateral. You can't expose rot without getting your hands dirty." Luke's face twisted with disbelief. "You call this justice?" Before Ethan could answer, a slow clap echoed through the room. From the shadows near the back, another figure emerged, umbrella in hand, the smirk of a man who'd been listening too long. Rick Dalton. His hair was streaked with gray now, his posture lazy but his eyes sharp. "You really sold him that story, Captain," he drawled. "You weren't investigating anything. You were running the whole operation." Ethan's hand went for his weapon, but Dalton was faster. The flash of lightning illuminated the moment, Dalton raising his pistol, grin widening. "You always wanted to play hero," he sneered. "Let's see how that ends." He fired once. The bullet struck a crate near Luke, splintering wood. Scout lunged from the shadows with a snarl, crashing into Dalton's legs. The gun went off again, wild, ricocheting against metal. Luke dove behind a pillar, shouting "Scout down," but the dog was locked in. He rammed Dalton again, knocking the gun from his grip, teeth bared in fury. Dalton stumbled, grabbed a second weapon from his belt, and aimed straight at Luke. A second shot rang out, but it wasn't from Dalton's gun. Ethan had stepped between them, the muzzle flash lighting his face for an instant before he dropped to his knees. The bullet meant for Luke struck him just below the ribs. Dalton turned eyes wide, but Luke was already moving. One punch, then another, the gun skidding across the floor. The storm outside howled through the broken roof as Luke wrenched Dalton's arm and slammed him against the crate. "It's over," Luke said through clenched teeth. Dalton's smile was weak now, mocking. "You think killing me stops it, there's always another." Luke's grip tightened. "Then I'll find them too." Dalton's head struck the metal, his body going limp. Luke turned to Ethan, who lay half-conscious on the concrete rainwater pooling around him. Scout crept closer, pressing his head against Ethan's arm, whining softly. Luke knelt beside his brother, blood mixing with the storm water that poured through the holes in the roof. Ethan's eyes fluttered open. "You still follow orders," he said with a faint smile. "Some things don't change." Luke shook his head. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan coughed a sound wet with blood. "Because you still believed the world could be fixed. I stopped believing that a long time ago." His eyes found Scout, then Luke. "End this, little brother. Don't let it become you." Lightning struck nearby, shaking the walls. When Luke looked back down, Ethan's breathing had stilled. The rain softened, almost gentle, now falling on two brothers, one lost to the past, one left to bear it. Scout sat between them, silent, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Outside, dawn began to break through the thinning clouds, the first pale light glinting off the spent shell casings on the floor. The storm that had drowned Cedar Hill for days finally lifted, leaving the air washed clean and sharp with pine. Luke Mason stood at the edge of the warehouse ruins as morning light crept over the horizon. Rain still dripped from the roof beams, each drop falling into the dark pools that mirrored the sky above. Scout sat beside him, his fur still damp, his breathing steady but watchful. The ground was littered with the remnants of the night before. Empty shells, shattered crates, the faint metallic scent of spent gunfire. A forensic technician stepped carefully through the debris, her flashlight cutting narrow beams through the mist. "Sergeant Mason," she called, holding up a weathered backpack recovered from near Ethan's body. "We found this wedged beneath the north wall. It's intact." Luke took it slowly, his gloved hands tracing the worn straps. The name tag was still faintly visible, Captain Ethan Mason, his brother's handwriting. He opened the bag expecting field notes or personal mementos. Instead, beneath a layer of dirt, there was a sealed hard drive wrapped in waterproof film. Next to it, a flash drive labeled with a single word, "Proof." Back at the sheriff's office, the data specialists worked in silence while rainwater hissed against the windows. Sheriff Graves leaned over the technician's shoulder as the first files appeared on screen. Dozens of spreadsheets unfolded, each one a ledger of illegal transactions, weapons, narcotics, counterfeit medical shipments. More chilling were the folders marked meetings. Inside were video clips grainy but clear enough to reveal familiar faces. Rick Dalton, several logistics officers, and 2 senior police sergeants discussing payout schedules and shipment routes. Graves exhaled slowly. This is everything she said quietly. Every link, every name. Luke stood behind her arms, crossed the weight of it pressing hard on his chest. Ethan had carried this for years, part guilt, part redemption. Send it straight to the Bureau. Graves ordered. No local chain of command. No leaks. Within 48 hours, arrests rippled through the county. Rick Dalton, still recovering from his injuries, was taken into federal custody under heavy guard. The 2 corrupt officers, confronted with their recorded confessions, surrendered without a word. The Denver division confirmed dozens more arrests across 3 states. News vans lined the courthouse steps, reporters whispering of betrayal and justice in the same breath. Through it all, Luke stayed quiet, refusing interviews. His focus remained on Scout, who had been injured during the warehouse fight, a shallow graze along his flank. The vet said he'd make a full recovery. When Luke brought him home, Grace met them at the porch with tears and laughter tangled together. "He saved you again," she said, hugging Scout's neck. "He always does," Luke replied softly. Weeks passed and Cedar Hill began to heal. The warehouse was demolished, its ashes replaced by a new training facility funded through state rescue programs. Luke helped design it: wide open fields, agility courses, kennels lined in rows. Scout trotted alongside him each morning, his gait slower but steady. The town called him the Miracle Dog, and even the sheriff joked that his name would outlive theirs in the reports. But Luke knew the truth. Scout wasn't a miracle. He was duty wrapped in fur and loyalty the living embodiment of everything Luke believed the uniform once stood for. Spring came early that year. On a clear Saturday morning, the town gathered in front of Cedar Hill's old courthouse for a small ceremony. Flags fluttered, children held homemade signs, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the crowd. Sheriff Graves took the podium, her voice carrying gently over the assembled townsfolk. Today, she began, "We honor those whose courage restored faith in this community. Courage doesn't always come from command or rank. Sometimes it comes from a man who refuses to stop searching, a child who refuses to stop believing, and a dog who refuses to give up." The applause was soft at first, then swelled until it filled the square. Grace stood beside her father, her small hands clasped nervously in front of her. Graves bent down and pinned a silver medal to her jacket. "For bravery beyond fear," she said. Then she turned to Scout, who sat proudly at attention, tail thumping once against the ground. "And for the unwavering heart that saved more than one life." She clipped a medallion to his collar, engraved with the town's insignia. The crowd laughed when Scout barked once, as if acknowledging the honor. Luke felt a warmth rise in his chest, not pride exactly, but peace. After the ceremony, as people drifted away, Luke lingered near the edge of the square, watching the sunlight spill through the thinning clouds. Scout lay at his feet, head resting against Luke's boot, eyes half closed in contentment. Grace ran ahead toward the fountain, her laughter bright and free. Sheriff Graves joined him quietly. "You could have left, started over," she said. "But you stayed." Luke nodded. "Someone has to rebuild what was broken." She smiled faintly. "And what about you? What comes next?" He looked down at Scout, scratching gently behind his ear. "The Corps offered me a new post," he said, "training rescue dogs. Thought maybe it's time to teach others what loyalty looks like." Graves nodded approvingly. "Seems fitting." The sun broke fully then, scattering the last trace of storm across the valley. Luke took a slow breath, letting the light touch his face. Scout shifted closer, his tail brushing the dust. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang steady, calm, the sound of a town remembering that even after darkness, life could still go on. Luke looked toward the ridge where it had all begun and whispered almost to himself, "Rest easy, brother." Scout lifted his head at the sound, ears perked, eyes bright. Luke smiled faintly. "We did it, boy." The wind carried the faint scent of pine and rain as they turned toward home. A soldier, a child, and a dog walking into a morning washed clean by justice, forgiveness, and the quiet endurance of loyalty. Thank you for watching this story from Cedar Hill, a place where courage, faith, and loyalty still mean something. If this story moved, you take a moment to hit like and subscribe for more true-to-life tales of hope and redemption. I'd love to know what you think. Which moment struck you the most? Do you believe justice can still rise from ordinary people and loyal hearts? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and share this story with someone who still believes that goodness never truly dies.